All right, I'm showing 3 o'clock here. Bless.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, let's get going. Well, welcome everybody, and thanks for your patience, those of you who have been on for a little bit. I'm Sue Osthoff from the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women here in sunny, sort of, Philadelphia, and I'll be one of your hosts for today's webinar, and Cindine Pizzell, our legal coordinator, will be the other one. Before we begin the presentation, I want to do some logistical stuff, and I'll go through this as quickly as I can because I know some of you have been on before. If you're disconnected from the webinar at any time, just go back to that original email that you got yesterday. You should, or at least should have received it. I know there was some problems for some people. And click on the link again to log back in. But if you're still having trouble, call iLink for support. And their number is 800-799-4510. And our assistant today, Dot Goldberger, just put that in the chat in the lower left-hand corner. So since I just brought your attention down to the chat box, why don't we all try that? You'll find that, as I said, down in the lower left-hand corner. It would be great if everybody could be in the public chat and just let us know where you're joining from. Your name should come up automatically if you're signed in with your email, so you don't need to say that. And if there's more than one of you there at your site, if you can let us know how many different people are at your site, that's really helpful. Great. You can see we've got people from lots of parts of the country. And somebody earlier signed in from Alaska. So good morning to you in Alaska. So thanks. That's terrific. So as you know, all the participants are muted. So we're going to be using that chat feature for any questions, problems, or comments. And we'll be collecting questions during the webinar, and time allowing, we will pose as many as we can to the presenters at the end of their presentation. So use the chat box for that. And if you joined us only by phone today, please email Dot with any question for the presenters or about tech stuff. And it's Dot, D-O-T, at ncccbw.org. And we are recording this webinar today, as we try to do with all our webinars. And you'll be able to access this on our website, which is www.ncdbw.org. In about a week, that should be up. We've also posted today's PowerPoint in a version that you can save or print, and hopefully the formatting on that one is good. We saved that in the presenters' bios on Google Drive, and that link was in the reminder note that you got yesterday, and Dot will post it again here. She already did. Thanks. If you're signed into iLink, you don't need to get the PowerPoint right now. You should be seeing that up on your screen, so I hope that's working out for you. Once we complete the webinar, actually when you sign out, you'll get sent an email that has a very short little message that confirms your attendance. It will also have information about the survey. So about a survey, and we just ask you to do this little evaluation because it really is helpful to all of us, the presenters and to us at the National Clearinghouse, just trying to figure out what we can do better and what other topic areas you would like us to cover in the future. Cindine, if you could move the slide forward, please.
You bet.
That would be helpful. So it's really helpful to all of us, particularly the presenters, to have an idea of who's on the call. So Cindine, can you see the questions up there?
Yes, I can.
Okay. I hope all of you on the webinar can also see them. So if you could actually answer the question directly on your screen, and I know it's a little tricky if there's 15 of you there in one site or whatever, but do the best you can to describe your profession. Just click literally on the little dot next to the answer there. So if you're community-based advocate, click on the answer there. If you're not one of the things listed there, if you can click other and then write into the chat box what your profession is, that's really helpful. putting up the results here. And then if you participated in the webinar that our presenters Edna and Noelle did in November, if you can also let us know. And really, we know that there's a lot of people, and in fact, it looks like most people so far did not attend that. And the presenters are very aware that there's many people who did not participate in part one, but it's helpful to know how many. And then if you also have served as an expert witness in an immigration case before, so right now it says 11% have said yes, they have. 33 no. It means people aren't answering that it doesn't add up to 100. And if you can go on down to whether or not you're an OVW grantee, that's really helpful. And if then you can also tell us what kind of OVW grantee you are, that's extremely helpful as well. And if it's other, if you can then put that in the chat box, that's helpful. So you're able to see the results, Cindine?
I can see them. Yep.
Okay. So what you're seeing there is that there's the vast majority look like they are community-based advocates and coalition or staff or other national TA providers. So that's really helpful, people. So thank you very much for taking the time to do that for us. Okay. Okay, so we've got a few more people on. For those of you who just joined, I'm Sue Osthoff with the National Clearinghouse for the Defense of Battered Women, and I want to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. And thank you for joining us for this webinar. This one is actually number 8 in our series of webinars about expert witnesses in cases that involve survivors of battering, sexual assault, and other forms of trauma. And if you missed any of the earlier webinars and are interested, you can get them. You can go get recordings that will pull up the PowerPoints on our website, and that's at ncdbw.org. We've mentioned that the participants are muted, and as I mentioned earlier, we'll be collecting questions during the presentation, and time allowing, we will ask as many as we can to the presenters during at the end of their presentation. So just please put your questions down there in the chat box. Before we go any further, I just want to give a quick thank you to the Office on Violence Against Women for their support of the project on expert witnesses. We think it's just really great they're supporting work about this very important issue area. So thanks to OVW. And as you're probably aware, today's webinar is called Understanding the Role of Experts in Immigration Proceedings Involving Victims of Battering. This is part 2, but as I mentioned earlier, it really is okay that most of you who answered the questions anyway were not able to or could not or did not participate in part 1. Like I said, our speakers do know that. And just before I hand this over to Cindine to introduce our speakers, I also just want to give a quick shout out to Debbie Tucker at the National Center on Domestic and Sexual Violence down there in Austin where our speakers live, because it was at one of her expert witness trainings that my coworkers first met and heard our 2 speakers today. And it's just been such a pleasure for us to get to work with them over the years. So thanks, Debbie, for helping to make that connection possible. So, Cindine, without further ado, I would like to pass the virtual mic over to you.
Great. Thank you, Sue O. It is really my pleasure to get to introduce these 2 speakers to you today. As Sue said, I heard them speak at one of their trainings down in Texas, as did other members of our staff. And over the past several years, I've just learned a tremendous amount from both of them. I'm going to do these introductions fairly quickly, but if you want more information, I encourage you to take a look at the tiny bio that you can see in front of you on your screen that's in the PowerPoint, or take a look at the more readable version that's on our Google Docs page that we sent along with the link to the webinar this morning. Read about these women because they know their stuff for sure. Now, this attorney and this expert have done quite a lot of work together. So in this particular case, I would say the sum of the total is greater than its 2 parts. They're just fantastic. Edna Yang is one of our presenters, and she is the General Counsel for American Gateways. At American Gateways, she directs legal services for that agency. She represents indigent immigrants before the Immigration Service, the Immigration Court, and in federal court. She also conducts training sessions both in Texas and at the national level, about how to work with and serve immigrants in the community. She also organizes outreach and education sessions for immigrant members of the community as well. Now, Dr. Noelle Bush Armendariz has done so much work over the past 20 years or more to end interpersonal violence. Currently, she's a professor at the School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Austin, and she's the Associate Dean of Research and Director of the Center for Social Work Research. She specializes in interpersonal violence, refugees, asylees, and victims of human trafficking, as well as international social work. She is regularly called as an expert witness in civil, criminal, and immigration cases, and she directs a national training on the topic. So it is my pleasure to introduce these two, and I think that I can speak on behalf of all of us and say thank you for your great work and for your willingness to present your expertise to us today. Edna, we're starting with you. Is that correct?
Yeah, we want to go through a quick overview of everything that's going to be covered today. So I'm going to very briefly talk about the types of immigration cases and revisit them. We had covered it in a little bit more detail in the first training, but I'll go through some of those different cases here, and then we'll talk more extensively about the collaborative relationship and what the role of the attorney and what the role of the expert is when preparing a case together. And then Noelle and I have actually prepared a case study and a discussion in which she and I will talk kind of as if we are trying to figure out how to best present a potential client's case, and then go through a demonstration of how to prep an expert witness, what to expect if you are an expert witness, and things to look out for. And then Noelle will also give an overview and tips about how to interview and how to write a report, and then we'll end with question and answer. So I wanted to start with types of immigration cases revisited. And I won't spend too much time on this because I think it's a little bit better for us to move on to the case study. But I wanted to briefly go through cases that are before the Immigration Service and cases that are before the Immigration Court, because there is a difference that's pretty significant in terms of the type of expert opinion that you would be giving. So cases before the Immigration Service are before a single adjudicator. Oftentimes those cases are only done in paper format. So if I'm doing a case like a VAWA self-petition, for example, and I'm speaking with an expert witness, I'm asking that expert, if I call Noelle and I'm asking her, I have an individual who needs an expert opinion. She's a survivor of sexual assault, a survivor of family violence, and there are a couple of things in her cases that concern me, especially if you don't have a background in family violence or in sexual assault. Would you be willing to read over her affidavit or meet with her and write something to submit to the Immigration Service? So anything before the service is really done in writing. There's no cross-examination. It's not an adversarial system because the individual is applying for a benefit from the Immigration Service. So they're applying for a work permit, they're applying for their green card or some other form of relief. Whereas before the Immigration Court, individuals are in a removal process. The government is seeking to deport them. So they've come to the United States seeking asylum, or they have been arrested by the Immigration Service and placed in deportation proceedings. So in that instance, when I am looking for an expert witness, I am preparing for a hearing, a full-out administrative hearing, and they're very different than any other type of civil or criminal hearing. There's no deposition, there's no discovery, but there is kind of that final hearing section. And so when I'm preparing a witness and an expert witness, I'll ask them about reports, what they think, what their expert opinion is, and then I'll need to receive that report in writing to submit to the court by a filing deadline, and then there will be a hearing where there will be testimony taken. And that is adversarial. It's presented before the immigration judge, and on the other side is a government attorney who's called trial counsel through the Office of Chief Counsel. So the types of cases that are before the Immigration Service, the four that I'm going to cover here are VAWA self-petitions, battered spouse waivers, UNT visas, and affirmative asylum cases. So VAWA self-petitions are a form of relief available for survivors of extreme cruelty, and that can encompass anything from psychological, verbal, emotional abuse to physical and sexual assault as well too. It is for those survivors who are married to a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident, or they are the minor child of a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident, and they can actually file a VAWA self-petition up to the age of 25, or they are parents and they've suffered elder abuse from their over 21-year-old son or daughter who is a U.S. citizen. And they can show that if it is a marriage relationship, that they entered that marriage in good faith, that they lived with the person who abused them, and that they suffered something called extreme cruelty. So in general, for the VAWA self-petitions, when I would seek to have an expert opinion is to prove that extreme cruelty prong, to show that the type of distress and abuse that someone has suffered meets that extreme cruelty standard. Battered spouse waivers are somewhat of the same thing. They're based in a marriage relationship, and they're based on a connection to a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident. And they're for someone who is married to a U.S. citizen but has been married to that person for less than 2 years when they receive their green card. And when that happens, you don't receive kind of what's known as your permanent lawful residency, but instead something known as your conditional residency. And after 2 years, you have to apply with your spouse jointly to remove the conditions of your on your residency. If you've suffered some sort of extreme cruelty, domestic violence, family violence, or some sort of psychological or emotional abuse, you can file for a waiver of that joint filing, and that's what the battered spouse waiver is. UNT visas are for victims of violent crimes and victims of human trafficking. And those individuals can apply for status from immigration if they can show a number of different elements, including that they've reported the crime to the police, but also that they have suffered some sort of physical or emotional sustained impact or harm from the crime that they've suffered. So a number of our clients are domestic violence victims, and so we have to show the lasting psychological impact of the abuse that they've suffered, whether it be physical abuse or verbal, emotional, psychological abuse that has occurred over a number of years. Asylum cases, whether they be affirmative or defensive, affirmative being before the immigration service, it's a little bit of the same thing, but it's for individuals who have suffered some sort of persecution in their home country. And that the individual or group that is persecuting that person who's seeking asylum is the government, or it's a private person that the government is unwilling or unable to control. So in those cases, the gender-based asylum cases are ones where we see forced marriage or domestic violence, where a country has very weak domestic violence protection laws. And so you see an individual who might have reported abuse to the police, but they don't get assistance because of the way that domestic violence is perceived. So those cases are generally, they turn on the fact that an individual's gender, but the way that we use an expert in those cases is to show that the violence that they suffered in their home country rises to the level of persecution, that the abuse is something that can qualify as persecution first, and second, it's also, especially in cases before the immigration court, we use experts to explain the behavior and mannerisms of someone who might have suffered extreme trauma and abuse or have been tortured in their home country. And that's a little bit about what our scenario today will be as well, our case study. So the affirmative cases are all filed before the immigration service, and the defensive cases are filed before the immigration court. So there's the asylum case, and there's also something known as VAWA cancellation of removal before the immigration court, which is very much like VAWA in terms of what you have to prove before the immigration court, but it's for someone who is in deportation proceedings. So that's general overview of the types of immigration cases that were covered a little bit more in detail in the first webinar. And so I think we're going to talk a little bit more about the collaborative relationship. And Noelle, I wanted to turn it over to you to actually start talking about the role of expert a little bit more here.
Sure. Hi, everybody. So I really enjoy working on these cases with Edna in particular, and I also have worked with a couple of other immigration lawyers, and I think experts have a pretty critical role. And by experts, I really do mean experts in interpersonal violence. The role that we have to play is to really help not only the immigration attorney, but also the court or the service understand the context or the content that you have. So you don't have to be a PhD to do this work. And one of the things that the lawyer will help you do is understand your qualifications, and qualifications can be based on number of cases you've worked, number of years you've worked, the position that you're in, so law enforcement, victim advocate, that sort of thing. So you'll get to sort that out with the lawyer. But the other thing that we really help those people and those systems understand is how a victim, and I'm using the word victim, I've been in the field for a long time, but I'm using the word victim because that's very much how these courts see this person. So it's important in this context to use the same jargon. It's important to help the courts understand in your written documentation the behaviors of victims that might be inconsistent with what they think they might know about domestic violence or intimate partner violence, so that you're going to start giving them alternative understandings for puzzling behavior. For example, why a person would have stayed for so long, or why they have fled across a border, or why they have left their minor children. And that's the content expertise that an expert who's been doing this work and listening to the stories of survivors for a long time can both help the attorney understand who might not get it. Now, Edna is one person who you don't have to help understand because she knows it. She's been doing it for a very long time and has the knowledge herself. But other immigration lawyers might not understand it. And then the court system or whoever you're writing to. The other thing that you're going to do is bolster credibility through the research finding or the literature itself. Sorry, my screen just went blank. Okay, here we go. And your experience. So what you're going to listen for is through the story of the particular case you're working on and see if it seems consistent with what you've heard over your years of experience, what you know from reading the literature, and then start to put together a solid document that bolsters the credibility of this particular client. And then finally, in the end, unlike other cases that you might be involved in where you might not give an ultimate opinion about what happened, in these cases you are often asked to give an opinion. In your opinion, was this intimate partner violence? And so part of what you're going to do is understand the definition of intimate partner violence and how that relates to this specific case. So you're going to bring your knowledge as a practitioner, you're going to bring some of what you know about this specific case, and you're going to bring what you know from your trainings, from what you've read, and package it in a way that can be presented in court. So you want to add about the role of attorney, Edna, here?
Yes, definitely. And I like the way that Noelle explains kind of the separate role of the expert, and I'd like to thank her for saying that she doesn't have to educate me very much. But I don't actually think that that's true, because I do recognize that I am not an expert in interpersonal violence, and I think that that is important for me to recognize, and the reason why I find an expert to explain behaviors of my client, or things where I might have doubts about why a client is presenting her story to me in a certain way that causes red flags for me. And if it does for me, then I think that it will very much so for an immigration judge or for an immigration services adjudicator. So my role is to really analyze the legal case and see, is there any relief for this individual? Can she apply for asylum? Can she apply for a U visa? Can she apply for VAWA? And then determine the strengths and weaknesses of my case based on that. You know, she may be able to apply for more than one form of relief. And what I'm trying to figure out is which is the strongest form of relief for her. Where are the benefits for her, and what are the risks of her applying for certain types of relief? And then from there, I'll develop kind of a case plan or theory where I will work step by step through what my ultimate outcome is in my case, and then work backward as to how I can actually prove that theory and prove what I want, get my ultimate outcome, right? So it would be get asylum for my client, get VAWA for my client, obtain my client's lawful permanent residency. So once I have that case plan and theory and I determine the strengths and weaknesses of a case, I look at those weaknesses, and that's when I try and find an expert who I think might be able to pinpoint some of the issues that I see in a case. And credibility really comes into play, especially when an individual is before the immigration court. The laws changed significantly in 2005, especially for asylum cases, where it was prior to 2005, prior to the Real ID Act, there was this idea that small inconsistencies that didn't really go to the heart of someone's claim, that could be explained through trauma or just could be explained as a person not having a great memory, as long as it wasn't something that was central to their claim, in an asylum case, wouldn't actually affect their overall claim. The judges would take that into consideration while looking at their overall, the overall strength of the case. After the Real ID Act, that kind of changed. It actually changed significantly. So now even minor inconsistencies that could be explained by trauma and other issues, even if they don't go to the heart of a matter that is being adjudicated by an immigration judge, can affect someone's credibility overall and can affect the case and outcome of a case overall. So you might have someone who very persuasively and credibly testifies to the persecution, to the violence that she suffered, but has inconsistencies in other aspects of her story because of trauma, because of the distance from the things that she's trying to describe in terms of time, and she can't remember them correctly. And so those things can really impact someone's case. And so I use an expert to really educate the court about, one, what interpersonal violence looks like, two, how trauma fits into that and how trauma can affect someone's ability to accurately describe certain things, especially if they are incredibly difficult memories, how that can affect that person's ability to explain those things, and then take the opinions of the attorney or take the opinions of the expert, and use that to argue my client's claim. So, you know, Noelle talked about bolstering someone's credibility, and while I do talk about that with experts, I think it's more to provide your neutral opinion as to what in your expertise that you've seen throughout your years of experience in working with victims of personal violence, survivors of interpersonal violence, and how people react differently to that and how people react to trauma. And then using those determinations, it is my then job as the attorney to make that persuasive argument that this doesn't harm her credibility and these inconsistencies can be explained away. And so that's something that it's important to remember, that the differences between one another's roles and how they work together and how they are very closely tied but are separate as well too. Because what I want is for my expert to be as neutral as possible, but also persuasive in the way that I can use their findings to make my case more persuasive. So I think we were going to then, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add one more thing, that when Edna was talking about she develops a case plan and a theory, the job of the expert is not to prove up that case plan or theory as much as is to make that independent assessment of the case from the stand of an expert opinion about the IPD. And Edna and I are real clear about that with each other. but we do have discussions about things in a particular case. It's not like a criminal case where I might stay a little bit further away from the attorneys involved in that case. These cases we go back and forth a little bit more. There aren't discovery issues in that case, but in these cases, experts are not there to prove up the lawyer's theory in the case, for example. But you will find that we find that we're aligned a lot, even if I don't ever know what her theory is going into it. Let's say it that way.
Yeah.
But after I've done my assessment, we're often aligned. But sometimes Edna will come back and say, can you clarify this piece for me? And usually I still don't know what your theory is. I don't think I've ever known what your theory is on it. So the expert's job is not to understand all of what Edna just talked about in terms of, I often have to write her back when I'm writing my case report to say, what is this client applying for? Because that will go in my brain and leave my brain often, and have to say, oh, is she applying for an affirmative asylum case or a VAWA case? Because in some respects that doesn't matter to me. I'm really looking at the content piece. As an expert, I let Edna do the lawyering part of it. So.
Yes, I think that is actually a really good clarification. And I will also say, yes, the process is very different because they're administrative proceedings, either before the immigration judge or before the service. And so it's not like your typical civil or criminal case where the expert does have to stay much more neutral. But I do think that they are probably the best cases to start as an expert for, because the rules for being an expert are much more relaxed. And I know that Noelle has talked about that before as well.
They are. They are great cases to start with in terms of learning how to be an expert. Although when you make the launch into criminal cases, you do want to get some additional training about how those rules change when you move into criminal proceedings, for example, so you don't get caught up in those rules. So I think we're going to move on then to the next slide. And we wanted on this webinar to give you a case to try to put it into action. And we sent everybody a case that we wrote up, Anna's case. And I hope you all had a minute to read over that case. We kept it to one long paragraph. And so I hope you have access to open that case right now and quickly read over it, and maybe we can summarize it for you. And we're going to ask you a couple of questions on that. And then you're going to hear Edna ask me a couple of questions as the attorney on the case and me as the expert on the case. And then we'll circle back and ask you about how you think we did and if we got to the issues. So Anna's is an asylum-based case of domestic violence that she suffered in her home country. She has left her home country and come to the United States after her husband was both physically and sexually assaultive to her, locked her in a room for weeks at a time without food or water, or very little food or water, and threatened to take her son, which eventually he did. She had sought help both from the police and from her parents, but her spouse wasn't ever arrested when she sought help. And when she sought help from her family, they encouraged her to go back with him. She fled her house several times, but eventually had to return to him. The last time she fled from him, she wasn't able to take her son, and he was eventually taken by her husband and brought to her in-laws, which is where he remained. When she told a friend after not getting any help from her parents, her friend was in fear for her life because her husband had threatened to kill her in the past, and helped her get across the border without any documents. So she's come to an immigration lawyer hoping to seek some relief based on asylum, and doesn't have much proof of the abuse. And do you want to add more to the details And I'm just going to check. Can people just quick check in on the chat to see if you do indeed have the case study handout? I see Dot has told you where to get it. Okay, yes, you guys do. And then do you want to add any more details that you think are critical before we move forward?
Sure. I think the last thing would be would be the way that Anna reports the abuse that she has suffered. And so when in this case study, I'm going to say that she came to my office and she reported all this horrible abuse to me, but she talks about it in a very particular manner, in that she's very deadpan. It's almost like she's reading a script and very routine about how she discusses the horrific violence that has happened to her and what's happened to her in the past. She shows no emotion, and so some of that raises some questions for me in terms of how will an adjudicator look at this case, or how will an immigration judge look at this case? Are they going to think that she's making this up, and why is she not more emotional?
Great, yes, that's a key piece. So what we wanted to do is try to use your chat function and start with a couple of questions on this case. If you're an attorney, what do you think the two challenges to Anna's case are? And if you're a potential expert, what do you think the two challenges are? And maybe you could just put those in the chat box, and Sue O is going to help coordinate some of those for us.
And Cindine.
And
but if
Cindine,
people
thank
can
you.
indicate if they're answering as an attorney or as an expert, that would be helpful too, please.
Yes, that would be great. And then we're going to, as you all chat about those in the chat box, we also want to talk about what other pieces of information might be helpful for you to gather as you think about this case. And then how you might explain her demeanor and what you might need to do that. And then what other information you might need that we call triangulate her story, which means add credibility or additional details. So I know that's a ton of information, so I'm going to stop for a minute.
And you all shouldn't be shy, because this is a made-up case of a whole bunch of different ones that Noelle and I have worked on together, and we don't think that we have any right answers. They all are different, and a lot of this is subject to opinion as well too, and so it's a learning experience for us as well. We'd love to see what you guys think.
So I don't know if I don't see much going on in the chat, and I don't know if that's a function of I can't see it or if it's not going on. So let me give you a couple of prompts. Would you want to meet with this client as an expert? Would you want to meet with this client? Sue O says she'd call you too. Huh. How many experts would want to meet with this client? Okay, good. I see lack of emotions may indicate trauma. Excellent. Great. So, Deborah, I see you're talking about wanting to meet with the client. What kind of things would you ask her if you met with her? We're going to talk about trauma. So a lot of you are talking about the trauma, and that's the last thing that Edna talked about. And I think you're getting to the piece about trauma that's really important. And you're probably going to experience her just like Edna experienced her as the expert in terms of her sort of very flat affect, and that might be a very difficult way to interview somebody, and also a very compelling way to be able to both write in the report. And that you have to remind me, in this case, would we go to court, this asylum case?
Yeah, I put this as we would go to court.
Okay, so then you would probably testify also.
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the attorneys talked about lack of emotion and documentation as two challenges to Anna's case, and I would definitely agree with that. And I think those are probably, from an attorney perspective, just based on the information that we have in this scenario, probably the two most challenging things. And so in terms of documentation, that's something to kind of work with Anna herself on, or to think about country conditions, things like that for an asylum case. But the lack of emotion and the way that she's telling her story is something that I would find really concerning. And so when I present it to Noelle, I mean, I think I would ask her definitely, do you want to meet with her, Noelle? And then also, so what do you think? What do you think? I mean, I think that's how I would address it with you, Noelle, is, so what do you think? This is what's happening. What are your initial thoughts? And then what do you need in order to move forward with Anna's case?
So I think my initial thoughts would be I would definitely want to meet with her and have my own assessment. And then I think my assessment would include probably a lot of grief going on because she's without her son. And then in these cases, often what I'm coming back to Edna with is asking if she can get a psychological. So we don't do this in a lot of cases with survivors of intimate partner violence for reasons of not wanting to pathologize them. But in immigration cases, unlike other cases, we are actually wanting to measure the trauma and repeated trauma, and I see a lot of these coming up in the chat: anxiety, depression. And so, as an expert who doesn't actually do psychological testing, I would come back to the immigration attorney, to Edna in this case, and say, I'd love for you to find a psychologist who could give a series of tests on depression, post-traumatic stress, and I can read and interpret those tests, but I can't actually give them. And usually Edna is going to comply. If she hasn't already done them, which in Edna's case, usually she's already done them, and she usually will send those to me. So that helps me then be able to substantiate the trauma that's going on in a different way as an expert. And then I integrate the results of those tests into my case report.
And so when you talk about triangulating her story details, what specifically do you mean?
So when I triangulate, I try to get a series of different pieces of evidence. Excuse me. So after I interview her, I take pretty copious notes during my interview with the client, and I use her exact words. So that's one way to triangulate. Then I use her affidavit, typically that you've already given me to read, as a way to triangulate. Then I go to my practice and think whether what she has told me is consistent with the research. And what we've done for this group is give them an example of a report that I've written. And so you can see how I've integrated the story of the life story, I don't mean the made-up story, but the life story of an immigration client with the research and how it is consistent. So now I'm building sort of my theory about this is a domestic violence case and this is why. And then the third piece that the fourth piece that I just talked about is this last piece of if we've decided, at least in Anna's case, that a psychological would be helpful, I would integrate that information into my report and my findings. So I would start to build my theory that domestic violence has happened. These are the ways that I can tell you it has happened in these markers. So triangulation is sort of pulling all those pieces together, particularly when there's a lack of other evidence, no police reports. I am not a country expert in any other country, really. So if Edna has a country expert who can write something, that might be the fourth or fifth way that I can actually add to my report. Or I can go to the literature and say, this is the state of intimate partner violence in that country, or the lack of resources in that country to protect her.
Noelle and Edna, you've both touched on, I think, almost all of the things that we've seen our participants chatting about in the chat box, so that's great. It sounds like people are really on the same page here. But a couple people mentioned knowing what the son is going through. Noelle and Edna, how would you weave that into the case?
Knowing what the son is going through in the home country?
In his home country, his experiences of abuse, or whatever it is that the son is going through.
Well, it's devastating. And it's probably maybe the most hopeless and helpless piece of this work when mothers leave their children behind. And it's happened more often, I think, in cases of extreme abuse than I've seen maybe in the last couple of years. And I don't know if that's because, Edna, you bring me the cases of extreme abuse where women are fleeing for their lives quite literally, and they need to leave their children. I haven't been able to do anything about that proactively. But I do know that their lawyers are, at least in one of the cases that I worked with, this was not an American Gateways case, but in one of the cases, that mother has been reunited with her children, but she was in extreme danger. Has that happened in any of your cases, Edna? I mean, I thought she was going to be killed if she returned because it was so obvious to me. And then as much as I could, compelled the court to try to seek relief for her children. And then I think her lawyers kept working on it.
So I will say, just from the legal perspective, if someone does win asylum, then they are able to petition to bring their children over as asylees as well. One of the complications in the cases that are based on domestic violence and a family relationship where you have a father whose parental rights have not been terminated in the home country is that in that home country, whatever family laws exist to ensure that there's not parental kidnapping, that both parents have equal rights, those are the things that might interfere with her being able to get a passport for her child, get custody of her child, and bring her child over. And I think it's interesting because the chat box actually has a lot of really great things about trauma-informed interviews and about talking with the client, talking with Anna using her own language, which I think is great, or an interpreter, which is definitely something that should be done. But if she's not comfortable with that, through drawing or writing or some other medium. But I think that it's maybe a good thing to explain now, like the difference between providing therapy and therapeutic resources versus an expert opinion. And so I would be interested, Noelle, and to get your opinion on that, because when I come to you with these cases, I have most oftentimes, if it is possible, sought some sort of therapeutic or counseling services from another individual and then come to you as an expert. And so can you kind of describe or the reasons why that would be? I think that might be helpful.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I haven't worked on any immigration case where the survivor is not engaged in the therapeutic services. So they are coming to me for the expert opinion and involved with the direct service organization for those services. That is not to say that the interview is not evoking. I try in my interview, I'm a licensed social worker, and I've done the work for a very long time, and I agree that the trauma-informed interview is incredibly important, and so I try to present from that way, and I also try to not have clients repeat a bunch of information. It took me a little while to understand that I could read the client's affidavit and that way get a lot of information. So the partnerships I have with immigration organizations here, like American Gateways and the others, is that I ask them to bring me in after they've gotten that information, so that I don't have to have the client repeat it all, because at some point in their cases, they're having to document and sign an affidavit, and so they have to do that with their lawyer, and I don't want them to have to do that with me again. So I will take that and list it as one of the things that I've read and reviewed, because I can take that as a document that they've sworn that is the truth and accurate information. Needless to say, I still interview them and want to make my own assessment. So it's tough, and what the son and the children of these survivors are going through are equally tough, and we make sure that they are looped in with services, and all of them have been. So we're well connected in that way, and I would hope that anybody would be. Having said that, if there is an immigration lawyer who's working completely on their own and not looped in with services, that would be something that the expert would need to do or should do, most definitely.
But are there any potential reasons why you would not want to provide therapy to someone and then also serve as their expert? I mean, you're a licensed social worker, so you could potentially provide therapy to someone. I mean, is there a reason why you think that might not be the best idea?
I would think that I would not do that. I would think that would be a very difficult dual relationship. I do think that the interview can be therapeutic, as I think research can be therapeutic, but I think that I would not do that. I would think that organizations that are providing expert witnesses as part of their mission would be really clear about where their policies are, because you could get compromised. For example, if you were in a relationship as a therapist and somebody said something like compromising, like, I just want to kill him, and then you had to get up on the stand and testify to that fact, that could compromise you and your client. So it would be important to think through what your policies are. It would be much cleaner to be either a therapist or an expert in a particular case. That way you don't have to make those decisions. So I don't provide therapy. It's very easy for me now not to be very clean.
Yeah. No, I think that that's a good thing to point out, because some of the folks who might actually be on the webinar on the call today might actually be giving therapy to folks. And in the past, for me, I haven't had that clear distinction, and this was a while ago, and I wasn't sure, well, what would be the problem? If you're giving therapy, you would be the perfect person to describe what this individual is going through. But then it was very clearly explained to me by someone else who didn't want to serve as an expert for that reason, that she felt very compromised, and that it also puts at risk the confidentiality that she has with the client that she's working with. There might be things that the client shares with her that may or may not have an impact on her case at this point, but that she doesn't want to share with me as an attorney, and I think those are important things to remember and realize. There are, within these types of immigration cases, especially something like Anna's case here, all these moving parts that I'm trying to fit together, but if I can't fit, it doesn't have to be that one person provides the answers to all of those different parts. And I don't have at any time a fear of saying, well, if Noelle, you don't feel comfortable doing that I'm going to find someone who can provide this therapy, and I have a country conditions expert, and I have an expert or an individual who's going to provide therapy, and I have another expert that talks about something else. And I think as an expert, if you are asked to serve as an expert witness on something, and Noelle is really good at doing this, and this is what I appreciate a lot, in saying, I can't actually do that, and here's the reason why, and I think you might want to get another individual to testify to this remote part or this section, and I think that's helpful to hear as an attorney to think about my case in a different way and say, oh, I might need more than one person, and there are all these moving parts. And so if you are serving as an expert, I would really encourage you all, if that's something you're not comfortable with, or if there are boundaries that you think might be crossed that wouldn't be helpful for you professionally or for your client, to put those out there.
Yeah. And I just want to go back really quickly on 2 points that I'm looking at the chat now. I would always talk about the son as a factor. If she has told me in the interview as an expert that he's been abused, or she's put that in her affidavit, I would put that. We know about the correlation between intimate partner violence and child abuse and or witnessing, and so I would definitely mention that as a factor in my case report, even if I obviously didn't get to interview him. And the other thing was the fear piece that I'm reading about now. I think that is one of the reasons she is fearful, and I think that you can talk about that as a way to substantiate, why she might have stayed, why she had to flee, and I would use her words as much as you could. Direct quotes are really important, and I think have big impacts in these cases. She told me, quote, and use that in an expert case as much as you can when you're describing. For example, the time she was most fearful in a physical confrontation involved, and you describe that, and then say what she said about him. I'm going to kill you, and I'm going to kill you with the machete, or whatever it was, is really important, because you want to, broker her case to the court, particularly if that's how she's going to present to the court. So that it gives the court, again, back to that original slide, the alternative explanation for why, for her behavior that might seem puzzling. Two other things, and then if we want to do, I don't know if we want to, sorry, I was just reading the chat. I don't know if we want to do a little bit of back and forth. I'm going to do a time check. Cindine, can you give us a time check real quick?
Yeah, we have about 18 more minutes before we were hoping to leave some time for questions.
Okay, great. I want to go back and just talk about two other things that may have come up earlier in the chat, and I might have missed them, that we might not have gotten to, but the issues around her parents who denied, sort of at least in this case, giving her help might have been, you might have, as an expert, been able to piece that out a little bit more, and then able to explain it either as a lack of resources or shame or a protective factor. So there might have been a cycle of violence going on where they were trying to protect, where she came from a family that had current or past domestic violence, and they were trying to protect that information from coming out, or shame about her being abused, or a complete lack of resources to help her. So when we talk about trying to build your theory, those are my information in the field tells me those things are possibilities. So in my interview with her, I would start to explore through very open-ended questions some of those things, but let her tell me what the reasons for why she couldn't go to her family, without judgment, of course. But then it gives the court this puzzling, because that is a puzzling piece, why she can't get a letter from her family saying it happened. That's the kind of thing that experts can bring to this case. And then was there anything else?
No, I think you covered it.
Yep.
Okay. So, did you want to ask me a couple of questions, or do you think we covered those?
I think we did, but Cindine, did you have something that you wanted to bring up?
No, I was just remarking on how throughout talking about what you would do to work on this case, things the expert and attorney would do together. Your thoughts and reflections really matched what we had there in the chat box.
Yeah.
So, great.
So,
Yeah.
this is Sue O. If I can ask one question before we move on.
Yes, please.
You know, Noelle, I think you have developed a lot of really great relationships with attorneys who already, like Edna, are real specialists in understanding the need for the victim, survivor to have additional support. And so not looking to you as expert to do that, but to get those additional supports. I'm just wondering, and you mentioned like the sole practitioner who's not as connected, and I'm also wondering, have you ever run into somebody who's concerned about the woman, quote, getting better before it goes to a hearing or to like the immigration court? Because we've certainly heard of that in criminal cases, and I'm wondering if that's ever come up in immigration cases for you, and if so, what would you recommend people do?
It's a good question, Sue. I don't know that I've only worked with one independent immigration attorney, and I spent a lot of time with him. The others have been connected to immigration clinics or nonprofits doing low cost and legal immigration services. So I would say they were on the high end of knowledgeable about and committed to the work. So I don't think that's the case. I've worked in a case, and this might have been your case, where we had a woman who we knew was not going to present well. And how she was going to present was she was going to probably giggle throughout the whole trial, right? The whole hearing, rather, right? Do you remember that case?
Yeah, that was my client.
Yeah, and we weren't going to try to stop that, but I was going to do a lot. If I remember, Edna, I was going to do a lot of, as I would remember, you were going to put me on strategically in order to help the court understand that giggling, because she was going to giggle throughout the whole thing, and because she giggled through my, and it was a trauma response. It was definitely, she giggled throughout my whole interview with her, and she had been through some very traumatic experiences. So it was just inappropriate laughing that was could be explained, but I think, was that right, Edna? You ended up putting me on strategically and sort of differently.
Yeah.
Usually I come on towards the end, but I think I went on before her. Is that right?
Yeah.
No, I can't remember.
Yeah. Yeah, I had you testify telephonically. I'd asked the judge for that and asked that you be able to testify first because it was telephonically and because of scheduling and because I said it would help with just the overall presentation of the case in general. And so I think that helped a lot in terms of being able to explain my client's behavior. And I think that it's important, and I guess, Noelle, it would be interesting to see how you would say or how would you approach someone who doesn't really know, an attorney who doesn't know very much about trauma or family violence, but who has taken on a case and said, you know, I really want to help this person, but I'm not quite sure how to do it, and here are all these issues, and they don't have a background in family violence or interpersonal violence, and kind of coming forward. I mean, how would you educate that person?
Usually well, this is how I do it in sexual assault cases. I have to have multiple meetings with them. So I sit down and that's part of my work with lawyers is have multiple meetings with them and say, this is how I'm thinking about the case. I'm offering them alternative explanations for puzzling behavior, basically, and then giving them theory that helps them understand it. But I have to have, so my strategy is to have it in ways that it's almost in, 5 points. Here are my 5 points. Here's my goal, and here are my 5 points with you. Because my experience with lawyers is that's almost how they think, or here's my analogy. It would be like analogous to starting a car, and first you need to have gas, and then you need to have keys, and then you need to have, my experience with lawyers is they like analogies, and so do courtrooms, although sometimes they can backfire, so you have to be careful. So I end up spending a lot of time on cases, which is part of the reason I have to be selective, right? And then I think I do a lot of saying no to cases I don't think I'm qualified on, or I'm concerned about. And then I see Toby Myers is on. I refer to her a lot if I've got concerns about cases. We talk back and forth as experts. She's one of my mentors in this field. So I don't want to be fearful to anybody, but I do think that you can't be a 11th hour expert. You have to do case preparation. There has to be some work beforehand. These cases make a difference in people's lives. So you have to be in it when you sign up for them.
Did you, Noelle, want to go on to the key to interviewing and documenting? Because I think that that's probably a good segue into that, and our discussion might be better served with you going on and discussing how you prepare these cases.
Sure. So this is, I think Edna said how these cases are different. In some of the criminal cases, you won't write for the court, and in these immigration court cases, you will write for the court. And so you really need to be able to prepare a case that does some of these things, documents how you're going to talk about the victim's credibility, or how you bolster that, as I said before. We've talked a little bit about the trauma and trauma responses and the puzzling behaviors, and then the use of other reports, which I love to use all the time. And then in the end, your professional opinion. So I think all of those are really important. I was a little bit, you can go on to the next slide. In my first couple of cases, I was a little bit disappointed because I was ready for, Edna did a great job on my direct testimony, and I was all ready for my cross, and I didn't get a cross because I was wanting that experience, and I didn't get a cross. So I didn't get to practice sort of that, people asking me questions that I was generally unprepared for exactly what they were going to ask me, because I think the government is not often prepared for what you're going to respond to. So a lot of times you won't be crossed. Sometimes you will. About half the time I am. You get asked those questions. But you can have your report in front of you, but in these cases you have to submit that documentation well beforehand. The lawyer should tell you when the due date is for that report. And I've given you an example of a report that I did for Edna. The reason I'm giving you this report is because this was a case that got sent back, if I remember correctly, because it doesn't involve a lot of physical violence. And I think, Edna, correct me if I'm wrong, the reason it got sent back is because they didn't think that it met the definition of extreme cruelty. Is that right?
Yeah, they requested more information. They sent what's known as a request for further evidence, and said that based on the documents that we had submitted, that it just sounded like she had a very bad relationship, but not one that met the extreme cruelty standard. And so this is why I contacted Noelle, because I did think it met the extreme cruelty standard. I just thought the adjudicator perhaps didn't have the background to really understand the coercive control that was going on in the relationship, because there was no, specifically, there was no physical abuse at all.
Yeah. So in this case, like the other immigration cases, I interviewed her. I didn't actually know all the details of her case, and so I drew my own conclusions, and this is what I prepared in. So this is a short report comparative to what I usually write. But we wanted you to see this, and we changed it enough so you won't be able to identify who this person is, but we wanted you to be able to see a case where coercion was really how this person was controlled by her husband. So this gives you some experience of how you document for the court, and there are other guidelines. But I think that you should, we've given you some bullets of how to write for the court. You know, use current research if you can. When you go to testify, if you're going to give direct testimony, in this case I didn't give direct testimony, this got sent off to Vermont, but document dates, times, length of interview, underline and italicize to emphasize things, and you want to, you can have your copy of your report with you, so things that you put in here you can highlight and sort of bring with you if you're going to give the direct testimony. What I have found is that the more thorough you are, the judge, the immigration judge, if you are going to give the direct testimony, will lift what you have said if they're going to want to affirmatively find for the client and put your findings in the court documents. They're looking for stuff to emphasize. I see a question, where do we get the best places to get the current research? Hopefully there's a university or a college and somebody doing this kind of research. We have some research that we can send you. You can certainly use the research that's available in the back of this report. And Debbie Tucker's website has some research. We can put that website up. VANet.org has some great research that you could put up on the website. And actually, VANet is a great website if you can type that up, Sue O, because it's meant to be consumable for everybody. It's not big research websites. And then I think if you just go to some of the government websites like CDC that have the most recent prevalence data and get the facts data, that's the best information to put in your research. And then you could always email us also. I mean, that's what we do for a living. So email us if you're getting ready to write a report and need one of these links. We can send it to you. Are there other questions on writing the report? It can be a little daunting the first time you write it, so send it to somebody and let them read it to see if it makes sense.
I have a question about reports for Noelle and Edna. Edna, you know, I know that Noelle talked earlier about making sure that the attorney is driving the bus in terms of what kind of expertise is needed for what kind of case and that kind of thing, and just leaving it to the attorney to kind of outline that. Is there a specific background that one would need as a domestic violence and or sexual assault expert to submit this kind of report? Do you have to be a certain kind of practitioner?
So no, there's nothing specific. So there's the Dober standard for experts in federal courts, but because these are administrative proceedings, it's not as strict a standard in immigration court or really before the Immigration Service. And so what the government looks at, if it's the Immigration Service, or what the court looks at overall, is the person's education, their background, and their experience in the area that they state that their expertise is in. So I have used experts in a number of cases who might not be researchers, who might not have a lot of work published, but have a number of years of experience working in the fields of interpersonal violence, or have a number of years working directly with sexual assault survivors, and they are qualified, highly qualified to identify certain aspects of that type of control or that type of abuse. And so it is more in the presentation of that individual and their expertise before the Immigration Service or the judge that I think will determine if that person is allowed in as an expert. In front of the judge, there is, I always ask the government, will you just agree that this person is an expert? I've attached their CV and information about their area of expertise. And I will say probably 50% of the time, most of the government attorneys say, yeah, I don't have any problem with that. I might want to ask some cross-examination questions on their actual report, but we don't have to go through the whole process of qualifying that individual. And other times, if someone hasn't actually written a lot of articles and the government feels that their education background might not be up for that qualification as an expert before the immigration judge, we will go forward and ask questions. And that's when I ask questions about the person's expertise in terms of their experience and their history as well.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And while you were talking about that, someone asked, and I think the answer is no, but somebody asked whether there was a format, a specific format that these reports would have to follow.
No, there's not a specific format. I think it depends, and it also depends on the questions that I may have as an attorney presenting a case and the questions that I put forward to the expert in terms of how it's formatted in terms of kind of subject areas. But Noelle, do you want to talk a little bit about how you structure your reports, because that might be more helpful?
Sure. This one is actually very dense. Usually I do many more subsections, but because this was going up for her VAWA case, I usually do subsections where I talk about my background and qualify myself, like I've done here. And then the second one is usually I do a little brief history of the relationship that I'm getting ready to talk about. And then I do an overview. So I've actually just made up my own format. Often, too, I have my paragraphs now numbered. This report is before I started numbering it. I think it's easier for a court to go through, so each of my paragraphs are now numbered, and I think that's much easier for a court to go through and say paragraph number 4. That's what I found. So, but nobody's told me how to ever write a report. I've learned by trial. So, and now I've, probably written 50 or 60 of them. The other thing I will also quickly,
go ahead, sorry.
And I know we're going to go to questions. We have 2 other handouts for you all. The first one that I'll point out is assisting survivors, and that handout is a definition of partner abuse defined, and then has some realities, and you all could pull from this. I trying to be descriptive in your reports is really important, so that you're communicating the emotions that the survivor would feel to the court, and then the impact on children, and then assessing risk is the last pages 5 and 6. So I have used these in trainings, but these might give you a way to ask questions where then you could translate these into a document to the court. So if you ask a question about has your partner threatened to kill or injure you regularly, sometimes, not often, or never, you wouldn't start out with that question, in terms of a trauma-informed interview, but you could say that if the survivor has said that happened almost every day in the last 6 months of our relationship, that's the kind of thing you want to put in the report. So I just put that packet together to help people who are starting off in the interview to as a tool that they might use in interviewing. And then the second one is a tool, potential questions for experts, that we looked hard and wide, although Toby, I might ask you to chime in if you know where this came from. This floats around. This is really for attorneys about how to question experts once they're in court. And we've asked a bunch of people who this belongs to, and I think it's a culmination of a lot of people's questions. But we wanted people to see what questions they might get as an expert or what questions they might ask as an attorney. So that's that final handout that we gave everybody today. So I think that's all we have. We can open up for questions.
Great. Thank you both very much. We did have one question. I know that it's not specifically about immigration stuff, but Noelle, we did have a question come up in the chat box about how to determine what a fair fee for an expert witness would be. Would you be willing to chime in about that?
Sure. I think if you're working as an individual on a case, you should probably charge an hourly rate and probably a standard rate based on your experience and your degrees. So depending on if you're so let me just say that whatever the standard rate is in your state based on number of years of experience and degrees, I think makes sense. So I guess I'm not going to give a set amount, but you should go back and sort of, I would do a short survey with people. How much do therapists make? How much do consultants make? And then base that, and I would charge it based on the hourly rate. Typically what I do is try to estimate number of hours I'm going to spend on the case, and then I give an invoice, projected number of hours and work based on that to the attorney before we get started on a case. I'm not a good person to ask. Because of my position, I get to do a lot of my expert witnessing pro bono, so I'm not a great person to ask. But I do, in government cases and in civil cases, I always charge a fee because lawyers are getting paid. But in cases where I'm working for clinics and NGOs, I'm not charging a fee. So none of my immigration cases I've charged fees in.
And this is Sue O here, and I would say there's a big difference between a fair fee and what people are actually getting.
Yes,
we should know
really
that.
True.
So that's for sure. I actually had a couple questions. And Cindine, were there any others? I didn't see any.
Oh, I had a bunch, but no, none others from the chat box.
Can I ask two questions, Noelle? Yeah. And Edna too. Maybe you can chime in here. It was interesting to hear me say that there's certain cases you don't take because you said you're not qualified or you don't think you're qualified. Can you give us an example of that as somebody who has a lot of experience being an expert, is a certified social worker, is a professor? What are the kinds of cases that you feel like you don't have the expertise?
I don't take any child abuse cases.
Because you don't have the expertise, or is that a personal preference?
I don't have the expertise.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's one of the areas that I just, I think I would not be a good expert because I think I would compromise the case. Because I haven't worked in that specific field, so, or done research in child abuse specifically. But having said that, I hadn't done any immigration work before. I think maybe Edna was the first immigration lawyer to talk me into doing this, but it intersected with interpersonal violence. So I felt like I could learn that piece of it. So basically my criteria for taking a case is, does it have to do with interpersonal violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, or human trafficking? And then usually I say, I will consider it, send me some initial documentation, and then I do an initial scan of the case and see if I can be of assistance. But there are cases that I turn down.
I just think it's really important information for everybody that we're not all experts in every subject, and it's okay to turn down cases. And in fact, it's probably really important never to go beyond your expertise.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, I probably turned down 3 or 4 cases, actually, that come to me.
And then my last question for now, I know we're almost on, is you talked a couple times, you mentioned that then you conclude by offering your professional opinion. And I'm sorry, maybe I missed it, but is it exactly what are you opining about? That she is a victim of battering, or that what the story that she told you is accurate? I just missed what the opinion is actually about.
Yeah, in these cases, so this would be different in criminal cases, but in these cases, my opinion is a couple of things usually. It's that I believe that that her story is consistent with other domestic violence cases, and credible, and I believe that she's a victim of interpersonal violence. Most of the cases I've had are women in immigration, and that she is, in many of the cases, is in harm if she was to be deported. So there are a series of things that I might do in a couple of cases around level of danger if she was to be deported from this country.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Noelle.
Yeah, and so I have overstepped, I guess, but I haven't been called on it in immigration, which is really interesting. I don't know, maybe Edna can, I feel like I've put stuff in immigration cases that I would have been called on in criminal or in other courts, but I can say, you know, look, like we do homicide assessments all the time, and I think there are red flags in this case, you know, and I say that in these cases that I don't think I could get away with in criminal cases. So that's what I think
I think that's
about.
True. Yeah, I think that's true. I think there is much more the ability for Noelle, for experts to give those sorts of opinions. And so, but that being said, I am very careful on how I structure questions for an expert when they're going on the stand, because you just don't know if you are going to get an objection or if that is going to be challenged in any way. So I always have variations of questions, and I will discuss those with Noelle and say, these are the reasons why I have these varied questions, and this is what I think might happen. And so she's not caught off guard either.
Yeah. And I just want to say one more thing. I see what Martinez Evans has written on the stand. She'll say sometimes I don't know, and I think that is a fine thing to say. I think we can't know everything. I also think the other smart thing to say is often opposing counsel in these cases will give you a case where isn't it true that, and they'll give you an opposite case of what the case is that is before you, and I think it's fine to agree to that case too. So they'll give you a hypothetical that is quite opposite or quite the opposite of what the case, the survivor in your case did, and it is much easier to agree in those cases. Isn't it true that most, battered women don't leave their children? Or isn't it true that, and I say yes, because if you engage in that, it prolongs the discussion. What you hope is that on redirect, your immigration lawyer will say, on the government questioning, they asked you these series of questions. Can you tell me why in this case that wasn't the case? And then you can go back and undo the record. You know, tell me why Mrs. So-and-so left her children again. Because if you get in an argument with the government lawyer, you've almost lost. You lose your credibility, because it could be true, right? That, I mean, it is true. A lot of women don't leave their children. So I would just say that if it's plausible, just agree to it, and then on redirect, let the lawyer who's engaged you correct it. Does that make sense? I hope that didn't sound like circular thinking.
Makes sense. Great. Thanks, Noelle. No, I think that made a lot of sense. If there's some loose end that needs to come back, that's where a lawyer can definitely come in and tie off that thread.
Yeah.
Sue, it looks like we're out of time here. And
yeah. Well, after we did part 1, we said we needed a part 2, and now I'm thinking we need to keep going. I have to say this has been incredibly helpful, as was the first one. And for those of you who are on, and if you haven't had an opportunity to hear the first one, you may want to go back and listen to it. It's a lot of very important information about immigration law and domestic violence and interpersonal violence. And just thank you too. I mean, you're just so terrific in sharing information, and it's just incredibly valuable. So thank you.
Thank you.
Edna,
thank you.
And thanks to all our participants, and thank you, Cindine, and thank you, Dot. And you know, we will follow. You know, you'll get notes from us, and if Edna and Noelle have anything additional to send to us, we'll make sure you get information on how to get that. So we will continue to stay in touch. And if you want to get announcements about upcoming webinars, please write to us at ncdbw@ncdbw.org and let us know, and we'll add you to our list. Okay? Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay. Bye.